Yat eshik do shidanae. This is Melanie Yazzie, the host of Red Power Hour. Both Red Power Hour and the Red Nation podcast, which is hosted by Lakota historian and Red Nation comrade Nick Estes, are sponsored by Patreon. Support our Patreon. Go to patreon.com, the Red Nation podcast. And don't forget, we need to reach 2,000 patrons to launch our third podcast series, Native Reads, which will feature Indigenous writers interviewing other Indigenous writers. We have over 1,000 patrons to go till we reach this goal, so please consider supporting us today. I hope you enjoy this promo clip for this week's episode of Red Power Hour.
Heck yeah, we're the real Red Scare, not these supposed ghosts of our ancestors. We are the ghosts of our ancestors, right?
Hell yeah,
right? Like, I think there could be something kind of badass about haunting, but like haunting as like a living Indian. Be like, oh, you're scared about the burial ground? Like, I'm gonna show up alive.
I'll scare you.
But that's kind of amazing, right? To think that, I mean, Indians are like the haunting of settler empire, but it's the fact that we're alive that haunts settlers, right?
Exactly,
We're like the unsettled business of settlement, basically, because they like couldn't get rid of us, and we're just like, fuck you, we're still here. Like, we still have nations, we want our sovereignty, we want our land back. There's a bunch of land back camps going on right now, and so we are like the existential threat to the United States. And that makes me think, Joseph, that like, you're talking about your grandfather. Boarding schools are like our haunting, like the concept of intergenerational trauma, which came out of like the literature and like the ways Native people were trying to address the intergenerational nature of the abuse and the violence that Indigenous people experience, because so many of our family members went to boarding schools and residential schools, that like intergenerational trauma is actually about haunting, right? Because it like haunts you through generations in your family and has like a real material impact. And so, like, if anything, boarding schools haunt us. And then our aliveness, because we weren't eradicated through that project, haunts like settler colonialism.
It's weird. I'm sitting in my my old room as a kid doing this interview.
What would you do if I sang out of tune?
So we're joined today by Nikita Longman, Emily Riddle, and Lindsay Nixon, who are contributors and or editors of a new Briarpatch issue that's focusing specifically on land back. So before we get into this discussion, I'd like some of our guests to introduce themselves, and let's start with Emily.
Nioto Timitik, Yatinis Gitanawa, Kakio, Emily Riddle, Nitasigasun, Otsenia Kaputigao, Maga Niwigan, Amisko Watsiwaskaigan. So my name is Emily Riddle. I'm from the Alexander First Nation here in Treaty 6, and I live in Edmonton, and I'm a writer, public library worker, and policy analyst.
And then let's go to Nikita.
Anine, hello. Thanks for having me, Nick. My name is Nikita Longman. I am a Saulteaux woman from the George Gordon First Nation in Treaty 4 territory in so-called Canada. I am lots of things. I am an auntie, a sister, a daughter, a partner. I'm a guest in Winnipeg, and I'm a community organizer.
And Lindsay.
Hi. First off, Emily, your Cree is getting so good. Holy. I'm like a mixie baby from the prairies. So my mom's family is Cree Métis from Prince Albert. And my dad is Nish, and he's from Tutanawazibing, which used to be called Valley River. But I actually grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan. And I now am very displaced. I live in Toronto, Ontario. I am a newly appointed assistant professor at Ryerson University. I'm a writer, I'm a curator, and I'm a soon-to-be movie producer. So yeah, that's what I do.
So I think I've met Emily and I've met Nikita, but I haven't met you, Lindsay, in person. So thanks for joining the show. And yeah, let's just get right into it. Like this term land back, I first thought on social media, I think it was an Instagram page that had the hashtag land back. And it was something that really stuck out in my mind and a lot of people's mind because that's the phrase that has crystallized indigenous demands since settler colonialism has begun. But I want to turn it over to Nikita and maybe talk about that term and why you decided to do an entire issue on land back.
Sure. I mean, as most great ideas start off, myself and Briarpatch's editor, Saima Desai, discussed doing something like this over brunch. So this was maybe about a year ago, and it's wild to see it and hold it in my hand. Briarpatch usually prints their issues with like under 40 pages, and the land back issue is this like meaty 60 pages. And I think from what I understand, it's the first issue in a long time that has gone into a second reprint, which is something to really be proud of.
Wow.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting for, Briarpatch as a independent publisher, and exciting for all the writers and contributors and artists that are included within it as well. But yeah, kind of like you, my first encounter with the concept of land back was on social media. And, my first impression of what that entailed was it felt different. Like it landed differently with me than, say, terms like decolonization or indigenization, which, are kind of like buzzwords that come out of, for the most part, academia. This whole concept of land back goes so much more beyond that and includes so many more members of our community. It's this accessible term. Yeah, I mean, we'll get into it further into the episode of what it all means, but it means so much to so many different people. And I think there's generally like a pretty good representation in what we decided to include in the issue.
Yeah, it's something that's very like there's no ambiguity about land back. It's like it's pretty straightforward.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Emily, do you maybe want to describe how your role as an editor in this issue and how you came to this project?
So Saima and Nikita approached me to be on the editorial collective, partially because I'd done work with the Yellowhead Institute on the land back report that came out in 2018. But also, I think we had a really balanced. We also worked with Dr. Alex Wilson, our editorial collective too, and so having a sort of like balanced approach, although like very prairie centric, balanced approach to what we were going to include in the magazine.
I was thinking about the prairie centricity, and I was wondering, I wanted to ask you, Emily and Nikita, if you did that intentionally, because Briarpatch is based in Regina in the prairies, and like, how can we talk about land back in the prairies without making epistemological space for prairies people to like think through land back?
Yeah, that was definitely part of the discussion, like that Briarpatch is based in Treaty 4, and I think that it's fair for us to want like very specific media, especially because we see like mainstream media being so attacked in Canada and not having many, like Alberta has very few even news sources for us to talk about these things. So I didn't really see it as too much of a problem. Also coming from BC, like I lived in BC for 4 years, and it's a very different conversation with they're around unceded territory and BC treaty process and that sort of stuff. So I think it's good for us to have our own silos of conversation.
Yeah, and I think part of, the way Saima and I approached the editorial was more skill-based. Emily, myself, and Alex Wilson just bring very different skills to the table. And I guess the one thing that we have in common is we're all based in the prairies.
And you also have a note in the editorials or the editor's introduction talking about where funding came from for this particular project. And you like in full transparency and accountability, you talk about the Human Rights Indigenous Reporters Program being, and it's part of I guess a Canadian media development organization called JHR. And some of that money comes from the RBC, which is a bank that advised TC Energy, the company, that's forcing Coastal GasLink pipeline through unceded Wet'suwet'en territory, but also is currently trying to build a pipeline through my land, or I should say our land. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that and like what, it's not that you're like directly condoning these particular energy projects, but nonetheless, it's actually the issue that you're trying to get at with this particular issue. If you wanted to maybe talk a little bit about that and how you navigated dealing with those kind of resources.
Yeah, this is a big conversation that we talked about over multiple meetings about whether or not we should accept this funding. It meant that the Indigenous contributors to the magazine got significantly higher payment for their writing. But yeah, it's definitely something I think that Nikita wrote this part of the letter, and it's very smart. So she could probably talk about that too.
I mean, yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Emily. And, Sima helped with this as well, who is the editor of Briarpatch. Briarpatch accepts like zero government funding. The magazine survives strictly on subscribers and sustainers, which unfortunately means that sometimes the payment is not substantial to contributors. So yeah, I mean, we rallied with this back and forth for a while, and I think we kind of just landed somewhere that it was more important to us as editors to be able to actually pay the contributors and pay the artists of this issue and pay them well. This meant hundreds of dollars more for contributors than what Briarpatch can normally offer. And for an all Indigenous issue, which is this, I think this is one of Briarpatch's first all Indigenous issue for the most part. I mean, there are a few non-Indigenous. There's one non-Indigenous article in there, but to ensure that they were paid well kind of rose higher in priority for us.
And let's talk a little bit about the contents of this particular issue. And one thing I guess like that a lot of people have a question that a lot of people have is like, what is land back? What does it actually mean? And some of the articles and the essays are very specific to like, here's actually how you give land back, or here's how you get land back, or here's how you reclaim or restore land. Here's how you negotiate the plurality of Indigenous life on certain territories. Here's how it intersects with the police state and surveillance, but also the city itself as a site that is Indigenous. And I guess I'll start with a question for Lindsay, specifically your piece, which deals with this idea of the settler city as kind of like a space that has already been claimed by, what you call like Facebook Karens and and the Karen phenomenon in general, which is like basically a white woman calling the police on Indigenous people for being on their own land, right? Mm-hmm. So walk us through, your piece and how you conceptualize the city as an Indigenous space.
Well, the way that I learned about the city as an Indigenous space was from other street-involved Indigenous youth. And it wasn't something that was apparent to me when I actually was a street-involved Indigenous youth. I think it's just something that came very innately out of an innate love for one another and wanting to support one another. And in my youth, this grew into specific community care work about healing bodies. So specifically around harm reduction, folks who are using in the city. And it just became more and more apparent that our bodies are connected to these territories in a very specific way, even if it isn't what we would consider to be this purist ideology of land. And I really love how Nikita talked earlier about these concepts of academia and how they can kind of, abstract what we think about the land. And I think about the concept of resurgence. And I know that has been so important in so many people's coming home or like understanding of how we integrate our knowledges into our everyday lives. But there is something about resurgence that's very specifically about a specific type of remote land. And then what does that say about Indigenous peoples who do live in the city, that they aren't sacred, or that they don't have connections to land, or that they're somehow less Indigenous? So that's something I think that I've thought about throughout my whole sort of trajectory of my work, is how can I apply these forms of teachings or just ways of being on the land to my life in the city and the kin I have in the city.
And you really are kind of unpacking this idea of surveillance, talking about your childhood and being constantly surveilled, but also like how one internalizes those kind of settler perceptions of oneself, and to the point where it affected your own self-perception of who you were as an Indigenous person within these predominantly white spaces. Can you talk a little bit what you mean by like digital surveillance, and what does it mean to surveil Facebook Karens, and also Karens in real life?
I always think about when I first came to Montreal and I first met Haudenosaunee people and Mohawk people, and I was like, these folks are so confident and they really know themselves. And I think about how much of my confidence I built living in Montreal and learning alongside Haudenosaunee peoples, and it made me think about my own sense of confidence and how it really was non-existent for a long period of time. And I didn't even realize it was happening. It was like a slow kind of chipping away of just living amongst a white community of people who despise you. And that's the best, like, I don't know how else to describe it. Like, I'm sure Nikita and Emily know exactly what I'm talking about, but there's just something that like central, most populated Native folks, they can't understand about this spatiality of living totally isolated in like a little prairie town in Regina, where when I was growing up, the racial demographics, it was like 98% white people and everyone else was Native. And the most intense forms of like racism that I experienced were sexualized and rape culture. And so, yeah, like I internalized that over like a really extended period of time. And I think I just hated myself and was very self-destructive. And I saw a lot of this messaging online. And it makes me think of, after this, I hate to bring up the Stanley trial again, but everything that happened around the Stanley trial and all the white families that flocked to Facebook to again blame Native peoples for the death of this beautiful boy because they can't cast aside their own interpretations of who we are. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm gonna get emotional thinking about it.
I mean, and we talk about sort of the way that, Emily, Lindsay, and myself have, especially quite recently, have been drawn towards one another in certain projects, and this sort of prairie extravaganza, as you called it, Nick, on
Prairie Palooza. Let's get it right.
Palooza. Okay. How about the alliteration? Got it. But yeah, I think what Lindsay's referring to is that we feel that connection. We feel that sort of lifelong building of who we are in the prairies, which can sometimes be such a daunting settler space in some ways. I don't know if Emily can kind of agree on that too in Alberta.
Yeah, I think that connection really like comes from, even if we're like different prairie Indigenous nations, we have like things in common, whether it's like sun dancing or like specific things, even if we're from different nations, but we also have this like trauma bond around like very specific kind of settler colonialism that exists in prairie like provinces and states, I would say. So it's both. It's like a life mode and all of the bad things that happen.
Yeah, I'm not from that specific kind of, I mean, y'all are more northern than me, but it is similar here. It's like, it's a rural kind of a geography. There is kind of like a spatial isolation that one feels. And, like it's scary. Like it's scary because things can happen to you and nobody would know about it. Right. And they actually like revel in that fact, that they feel like a sense of entitlement, not just to the land, but to basically do whatever they want and get away with it. I feel that very much. Like, even I have a friend, she's actually the chair of our organization, the Red Nation. She's a co-chair, and she's LGBTQ, and she recently moved back to her nation in North Dakota. and she's been assaulted, she's been stopped by the police, and she's scared of like actually disappearing, like being disappeared as somebody who's moved. And this is the reason why she moved away in the first place, is because it was such a hostile, dangerous environment, not specifically on her reservation or her homelands, but outside of those, in those, what we call down here border towns, the kind of like white dominated settlements, Satring Indian reservations. But it's something that it doesn't translate into other kind of geographies as the way it does in this specific region. I don't know what you all think about that, but
no, it makes sense. I mean, small towns in the prairies are terrifying. I definitely have done my driving on the highway almost close to E on my gas tank and just feeling like this surge of panic, being like, where the hell am I going to pull over if something bad happens? And I think, Lindsay's piece really encapsulates that in the ways that settlers who are now farmers feel this strong sense of ownership in the land that is literally lethal. And we see it time and time again. And, as Lindsay referenced, this Stanley trial is like a perfect definition of that in action. And it's something we're all contesting with, I think. And I feel like especially strongly for your friend and Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and trans people who have to kind of exist in these prairie landscapes. It's not easy.
And Lindsay, you specifically cite Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt and how they talk about kind of the basis of this surveillance, and also kind of the settler normativity that exists is based in a settler heteronuclear families, which is grounded in literal property ownership, and like property itself it kind of becomes, like the Cheryl Harris, the critical legal scholar, had that famous article called Whiteness as Property. And it's very much so in like the settler colonial context. And, how is, the heteronuclear family grounded in property ownership kind of the basis of settler surveillance for Indigenous peoples in these prairie, specifically these prairie regions?
That is an amazing article. Thanks for bringing it up. And I just want to give a little plug that Gina and Dallas just released a book, an extended book of that paper through Art Books that is available now. I think what I love so much about that article is that it foregrounds misogyny as this really inherent part of the settler colonial order, especially in the prairies, where there were these parcels of land. I hate saying that, but these parcels of land that were offered up to settler peoples to come settle our territory so they could force us out of our own lands. But the people who had ownership over these farms were men, and it was like the property that they owned. And then they were able to construct this like family of their wife and their perfect white children as this nuclear unit that they were pushed to protect at all costs against the savage forces of the Cree and Anishinaabe and Métis people who lived around them. And I mean, when I look back and now that I have access to archives and I'm learning more and more about who we actually are as a people and breaking apart the discourse, like, yeah, we were angry and like, yeah, we did burn shit down and we did steal stuff, but we were mad. Like they were settling our territory. So of course there was conflict, but the way that Indigenous people were portrayed, it was like, it's very parallel to the ways that white colonizing rhetorics have criminalized Native and men of color all over to say that they are a risk against perfect white families and children and women.
Right. And like here in the States, I think it's kind of really codified in something such as the 1862 Homestead Act, which categorically, excluded Black folks and Native folks from, participating in, the kind of parceling out or the commodification of land. I think is over 270 million acres of territory that literally created the generational wealth for, generations of white settlers, and how, they literally got free land. And so when we talk about, the disparities of socioeconomic statuses or whatever, it's literally grounded in land. It's not some kind of like abstract thing where it's like, oh, land is out there. It's actually who owns the land. It's actually about political and economic power in a settler colonial context. I want to turn to Emily's piece It has a Cree name, and I cannot pronounce it, so I'll just say the subtitle, which is Shared First Nations and Métis Jurisdictions on the Prairie. And this is a really beautiful piece, I think, because oftentimes we are confronted as Indigenous people with always kind of defining our rights against, in the negation or the negative of the state itself and what it does to our people. And so we think of sovereignty as kind of this monolithic thing. And you really trouble that in this particular piece, specifically thinking about the Northern Plains and the overlapping jurisdictions, and the plurality of jurisdictions and I'll just read you. I'll just read you back, a quote from that piece that really stuck out to me. You write, European political traditions would have us believe that being sovereign means asserting exclusive control over a territory, whereas Prairie Indian political traditions teach us that it is through our relationship with others that we are sovereign, that sharing is not a sign of weakness, but of ultimate strength and diplomacy. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that specific quote, Emily? Because you begin the piece by actually mapping territory through your kinship relations in your own family tree.
I think, it really comes down to, I think sharing is really hard and requires us to constantly be in dialogue with each other. And diplomacy is tricky. And I think that that often gets erased, like the treaty making that we did before white people were here gets erased, and how we dealt with each other and our different governance systems is not talked about. So the fact that we're able to share this territory at some point, and that is not without hiccups, especially in the prairies where there's like a plurality of Indigenous peoples and some movement that doesn't exist in other places, that it was hard. And if you look at any sort of like archival evidence, there was always fighting. Like not that far from where I live, there was a battle between the Cree and the Blackfoot. Like Edmonton was always a fairly contested place between those two. And I know, like, for example, one of the reasons that Cree people are more numerous in Edmonton is because of smallpox, because the Blackfoot wouldn't eat fish when the buffalo were less. So sharing's not always been pretty, but I think that we have really started just appealing to the provincial and federal governments in Canada instead of being in dialogue with each other. And I don't think we've even started to really map out where our territories are, like they have in BC. In most places in BC, there were never treaties. And so they have this BC treaty process, and I believe it's in stage 2 where you get funds to map where your territory is. And one of the major reasons, there's a lot of reasons the BC treaty process hasn't gone forward, but one of them is because of this overlapping territory and the inability for like settler governments to be able to kind of contend with what it would look like to share territory. So I think we have to turn to our own kind of governance modes and traditions to figure that out and stop asking white people how to do it. Or if we're going to get our land back, we have to figure out how to share again.
Yeah, and you make the point that it's like a very kind of like fluid governance structure that the current kind of colonial structure kind of constrains.
I just wanted to give Emily props. I feel like she's being so humble, but the critique that she took on in this article is so political in the prairies, and it's so conflicted, and she dealt with it with such grace, and also just like Cree badass woman governance, like totally uncompromising, and it's a great critique.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good piece. Like I felt like I had a better understanding, because it's something that comes up down here too, because it's like everyone just thinks it's all Lakota, and I mean, it is true, but it's, there are other nations that we live in relationship to and we share space with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I don't know where I am. Everyone will always say like this is Plains Cree territory, but there's Nakota people here and Dene people, and this is always shared. So I don't think it weakens our claim to say that other people were here. And I think like also like the kind of different constitutional categories we're working with between like First Nations and Métis and is not always clean cut either, and really has fragmented how we deal with each other.
And you bring up this point about like neutral zones, and like I don't know the name of the lake, but you're talking specifically about a lake and like how all of these different indigenous nations have relations to that specific lake. And we have the exact same thing. So like here, at what's called the Pipestone Quarry in Minnesota, that was actually considered neutral territory. No one was ever allowed to do a ceremony there. Nobody was ever allowed to, stake any kind of spiritual claim to that specific place, because it was such a valuable pipestone quarry that, like, literally the indigenous nations of the Western Hemisphere used. And to claim that territory as, like, Dakota, or I'm trying to think of the other nations that were in there, Iowa, or the Sac and Fox, or whoever in that particular region, it would actually diminish, the access, the free access to that pipestone that everyone needed for their, for their pipe stems and everything else in that nature. But the way that kind of the Westphalian state model applies is that sovereignty is about exclusion first and foremost. It's not about, as you say, about relationship and accountability and reciprocity.
Yeah, we have stories about that site too, but yeah, there's lots of different neutral zones in our territories that we agreed to never fight in that had spiritual significance, and I think that's definitely a way to turn back and think about how we dealt with those areas, and how, like, Manitou-Sagaigan, or Lac St. Anne, what is the Nakota word? I'm so bad at this. I should say the Nakota word too. The Sioux word, Wagome. It is now a site of a Catholic pilgrimage. So there is, the tradition around the lake has changed, and there are still gatherings of various nations, like people come from the north and south to go there for this Catholic pilgrimage, but all of the lots around that lake are all privately owned, largely by settlers, and it's very expensive real estate now too, so we're not able to access that site in the same way as we were at some points.
Yeah, and your piece really made me think about Lindsay's piece as well, as about, like, the cities and the urban spaces, places where, like in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for example, there's over 270 indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. And obviously not all of them are from there, but it's still considered, Albuquerque is, like, very much an indigenous city. And when I went to, when Nikita gave me the tour of Winnipeg, we went to Nietzsche Common, or Nietzsche's Common. I don't know if I said that right. Nietzsche's Commons. And, Winnipeg itself is also an indigenous city. There are many indigenous people there. But I was thinking about your piece, Emily, in relation to like the work that Nikita and Lindsay do, and thinking about urban spaces as indigenous spaces, because there are overlapping kind of, indigenous nations in these city spaces. Some of them are not on their own kind of like traditional or historic territories, but nonetheless, they don't stop being indigenous in relationship to other nations of people, right? So I was wondering if Nikita or Lindsay wanted to kind of reflect on that and thinking about these shared spaces and negotiated spaces of the city itself.
Well, yeah, you kind of totally beat me to that whole concept. I know it's not necessarily the focus of Emily's piece, but yeah, you draw a good connection between Emily and Lindsay's piece, in the sense that, like, how would we ever negotiate sort of dividing up these city landscapes? And thanks for bringing up Winnipeg. Winnipeg, as I've learned as a guest here, sort of claims itself as the largest urban reserve in Canada, and that's largely part to the higher Indigenous population here. And I mean that it's going down a different path, but also keeping in mind people who aren't entirely sure of where their ancestors are from because of things like the 60s scoop or residential schools, or now presently the child welfare services. It would be impossible to not have these spaces be shared amongst those people, especially urban spaces. And yeah, I'm sure Lindsay has lots to add to that too.
Yeah, I agree. I don't even know how maybe it's just inherent to me as someone who has also Métis family members. My mom lives in East Side Saskatoon. I have lived in apartments in North Central Regina, which is like one of the most Native neighborhoods in quote Canada, end quote. Like I would love to see like some res folks in North Central Regina. I don't even know like how that would go down. Like, and even like La Ronge, like northern towns, which are like just they're reservations, but they're cities. Like, I just don't know how to separate these things, especially as folks who have these histories that are really correlated with like spaces that became like I don't know, colonial monument almost, but they mean different things to us. It's like the cities exist now in these territories that still have the same sort of spatial comprehension for these spaces and these rivers and these song lines that we had before the buildings were there. These are still our lands. It doesn't matter that the buildings are there. This is still Cree territory. This is still, I'm not going to say Métis territory because I know that's complex. This is still Nish territories.
Yeah, I also think about like how even the idea, like, you know, here in the States, it's like city Indian is like a common, or urban Indian is a common kind of epithet that's leveled at people. And, you know, like in, you know, going back to Albuquerque, just because that's the biggest city I've ever lived in. It's not really a big city, but, you know, it is a city to me. It's like I get lost. Like the only way I can navigate is through looking at the mountain. That's like, and I drive like 20 miles an hour, you know, everywhere because I'm not used to traffic. but you know, one thing that I notice about a lot of the people we work with, like in the city itself, we do a lot of you know, mutual aid work with our relatives on the streets, is that they're not entirely, you know, quote unquote urban Indigenous people either. Like most of their families are between the city and the reservation, and there isn't this clear, like distinct kind of boundary between like, oh, you're a city Indian or you're a reservation Indian or whatever, because Albuquerque itself, you know, it's Tiwa territory from the Sandia Pueblo, and you know, but at the same time, it was also a crossroads for trade, and it's always kind of been a plural, kind of diverse space for many different Indigenous people to come and, you know, do whatever they had to do, trade and this and that. So it's not like this like easy boundary between like on reserve or off reserve or on reservation or off reservation. And in fact, you know, like here in the States, like off reservation is like used to identify like people who are basically criminals, right? And it's become like normalized within the political rhetoric. You know, somebody who goes off reservation is considered like a renegade or an outlaw, and it's like people use it. It's a common American idiom, right? But I was thinking about that when I was reading, you know, Lindsay's piece in conversation with Emily's piece, because you know, Lindsay's piece is about surveillance, while, you know, Emily's piece is really about like this really beautiful diversity and plurality that exists, you know, sometimes in tension with each other. But you know, I want to return it back to the conversation of, you know, land back in this particular issue, because I think a lot of people have kind of, you know, some reservations about that terminology, and no pun intended. But you know, land back is something that really cannot be, in my opinion, it's so clear, crystal clear, that it can't be really co-opted. You know, things like decolonization tend to be watered down once they become institutionalized, right? And Lindsay had brought up the idea of resurgence as something that becomes kind of a spatial politics of somewhere that's not the city, right? Oh, we only do resurgence work out on the quote unquote land, as if the city is not land itself. But I feel like land back is, you know, for lack of a better term, a little bit more militant, in the sense that it's like very clear about its aspirations. I want to ask Nikita this question. You know, what are the practical steps for land back? Because you have a settler frequently asked questions, or a FAQ, as part of this issue. And maybe you can walk us through, like, what does that actually mean? What does land back actually mean? What does that process look like?
I mean, like, I don't want to invest so much emotion on this settler FAQ. We figured it was kind of, I mean, a lot of settlers also are subscribers to Briarpatch, and they would be getting this issue in their mailboxes. So we definitely wanted to try and clear the air with some of those things. I mean, like Emily says it in her piece too, there's so much about, like, there's so many complications within the settler government system that really makes settlers question land back. And I like how you mentioned how it's so cut and dry because I don't know, the term itself it's almost like a demand. Like it's not quite like an ask. It's just like land back, period. Like there's no, there's no question to what the statement implies. But yeah, back to the settler FAQ, we kind of just wanted to really clear the air on some of the logistical questions that some people who might be new to the land back movement might have. So we thought that there should be some of that should be lawyered, which is why we have Brooks, Arkan, Paul do some of the sort of legalities of what that would look like. And then there's me just adding in some last minute sass after Brooks kind of goes through the legal portions of it. Because, yeah, I mean, the undertones of land back, as much as, you know, there are some legal complications we'd have to wade through, there is also some sass in it. So I felt like I needed to add some of that in there.
I think it's also like land back is definitely a reaction to this like era of reconciliation that we're coming out of that was like so early, like co-opted so early. And we see our prime minister start to use words like decolonization, intersectionality, like reconciliation, and they've become meaningless, but there's just like no way for him to do that with land back or anyone else.
While in blackface, he's doing all of this while in blackface.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really hard movement to co-opt. Like it is what it is. I love the statement, like the firm statement of it. But I think one of the things we were clear on when we approached this issue is that this is not an exhaustive resource. Like we could go on, and land back means so many things to so many different people. And we understand that this is obviously, a very so-called Canadian interpretation of what it means. But even within that, we see subjects ranging from language revitalization to reclaiming urban spaces like Lindsay's piece, or, sexual sovereignty, and also, weaving through some solidarity with Black kin and our Black relationships that we share on these lands. And I mean, I feel like even though there's such a wide breadth of knowledge that went into this piece, that we only scratched the surface. I don't know if Emily, as a co-editor, would agree with that.
I don't think that idea was ever to do kind of like give an exhaustive how-to. And like in my interview with Elder Joanne Saddleback too, she like definitely complicated it as well, saying like if we do get our land back, it would mean that we would speak a high Cree and we would be in relationship with all these deities, and we would like things would look really different. So I think it means something to everyone, even though it's hard to co-opt.
I mean, the way I see it, it's also about like futurity as well. Like I think like the idea that like I mean, just as me as an outsider, I don't know, I'm not like well versed on the intricacies of these particular politics, but the way that I see something like reconciliation is like, oh, we're going to move past the past, right? We're going to go beyond and enter a new era without really changing the fundamental like relationship between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples, which is that this was always a land-based enterprise. And if you're not going to like undo the first issue, it's not a Indian problem. It's a settler problem, right? It's a Canadian problem. And if you're not going to undo that, then it's like you just enter a different era and like of resistance that's going to fundamentally challenge, it's going to pose an existential. I see it as posing an existential threat to this, like Canada as we know it, but also I would say the United States, because if your entire enterprise, political system, governance system is premised on the dispossession, elimination, and genocide of entire nations of people, then the only way to like reverse that is, yes, it's land back, but it's not a return to something, right? It's actually it's an aspiration, it's a future oriented project. At least that's the way I think of it, and I especially think of it in the piece, the Métis in Space piece, the Back to the Land, Too Furious, which is a really funny title.
Yeah, I think futurisms was for sure a priority that we wanted to include in this. But I mean, that said, like, there also is some, I mean, like Mike Goldhawk, for example, writes about, I mean, he helped us out with somewhat of a timeline. I mean, how could we ever even try and execute a concise timeline of all the ways that our ancestors have already achieved or have already worked towards their version of what land back is? I mean, it's been happening for a long time. And one of the things that I like in Mike Goldhawk's written piece, he kind of describes, and I'm summarizing, but how the state can't actually hide or remove the physical land from us, but the ways that they've tried to achieve taking land away from us are through things like language loss or cultural loss or ceremonial loss. And so when we talk about land back and we talk about it as a futurism, there is an implication on us achieving a, an end goal where all of those things have come back to us. So, I mean, it's complicated. It is future, and it is based on the past for sure. I mean, now that it's in meme form, it feels very new and very fresh to think about land back. But yeah, our ancestors were always working to certain versions of land back long before we started to make memes.
Well, I think the memes are like kind of like a poetry in some way of like, you know, like even the idea of land back, you know, it was spray painted on a riot shield at a protest here, defending treaty lands in Hisapa. And it was such a like, you know, there's like not all poetry is words, but like land back itself is poetry because it's like it cannot, I don't know, I was thinking of this maybe I'm getting a little too philosophical, but when I was reading this and you know going through my notes, I was thinking of this like this Herbert Marcuse quote, and maybe this is but civilization, he writes that civilization has to protect itself against the specter of a world which could be free. I always thought about like land back as like it actually like settler states have to protect themselves against the specter of a world that could be free. But even the idea of thinking of indigenous people as specters or as ghosts, that we're only allowed to commune with like other ghosts as if we don't even exist materially on our own land. And this is like bringing, you know, bringing that into the forefront. Like it can't be ignored because I think it was in 20, I think it was this year. I don't know the year. My dates are getting so messed up because of the Rona. But like this year, like when the Wet'suwet'en protests, solidarity protests and blockades emerged, it was no longer about like, yeah, let's do another consultation process. It was like, it was not just the Wet'suwet'en, but it was everybody else saying like, fuck you, like give us our land back. And that can't be, you know, that's kind of like an aesthetic. It's an aesthetic, yes, because it comes in meme form, but it can't be fully absorbed by like the state. It can't be absorbed through that kind of like recognition process, right? They're not going to hold, you know, they're not going to be like, we're going to recognize your land back, you know. It's like I don't know, it was something that I was thinking of when I was listening to you talk, but also reading this entire issue.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I totally, have so much faith and want to take this moment to recognize Gen Z. Like, I am here for you and all that you do and all your memes and all your land back spray paintings on all kinds of surfaces. In Winnipeg, someone spray painted land back on the RCMP headquarters, which was kind of cool. But yeah, like it's everywhere. It's really making the rounds.
Yeah, I feel like we haven't even touched on the fact that land back was such a meme-based movement to begin with. And a lot of people say that Arnell Tailfeathers was the first person to say it in one of his memes. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's becoming very a knowledge that's getting passed around. But there's something about like digital disseminations and Instagram and TikTok and our movements and thinking about how we're talking about land back as this way that was made to disseminate these knowledges and activisms outside of academia. And now, I mean, I hate to tread into this territory, but like cultural safety and institutions, and this whole thing happening out here with the Eastern Métis, and like what it means to be a Native person, and like what that feels like, and how we are intelligible to each other, and the way that we found each other in this movement for land back was through memes and by just mirroring to each other, like, I don't know, inside humor. And there's something very, it's like a temporality that we create outside of the land that's like virtual and like spatial and epistemological, and I don't know, I just think that's really beautiful.
It's like that kind of eyebrow look that our uncles would give another uncle across the gas station or whatever. Like, now
Wow.
we use it in memes, and we're signifying it like, from all over Turtle Island to one another. Like, it's the nod. It's become the new nod, the virtual nod.
Yeah, and everyone understands what it means. There's no ambiguity about it. Yeah, like in Mike Goldhawk's, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but Mike Goldhawk's piece, he writes that land, isn't a thing; it's a social relationship, and I think, like that really gets at the crux of this particular, hashtag, is that this isn't just about the return, because there's this kind of like this repressed like fear, like in settler horror movies, it's like, it's Michael Myers, right? It's like the suburban landscape, it's all like white people that live there, and then there's this an unstoppable force, which is like the repressed kind of violence that is embodied in somebody like Michael Myers, who just like can't be stopped, and he's just killing everybody. And it's kind of a slight, maybe I'm going off the rails on this.
You're just trying to like give a shout out to your Halloween month.
Yeah.
On the podcast.
Guilty. Yeah, I'm trying to. It's October, and the entire month is Halloween for us. Let's just be honest. I'm trying to tie it in, but like Michael Myers, he's a white kind of like faceless, thing that just keeps going and killing, right? But there's kind of an acknowledgement there that like this land, like even though it's not acknowledged, all the time in public or in the mainstream kind of consciousness of a settler society, that this entire country, this entire nation is built on the genocide of Indigenous people, it nonetheless is an acknowledgement. And so when there's a fear of like land back, when, the settlers are like, well, we can't just give the land back to people because they're going to do what we did to them, and I think there's this kind of like in my understanding and reading these pieces, and talking with you all, that is actually, there's no future. They're like implicitly acknowledging that there's no future for them on this land. Not, and by them I mean like their governance structure, because it's entirely based on genocide, exclusion, racism, theft, white supremacy, capitalism, the commodification of life. And they've actually already admitted that they don't have an alternative to this, and that's kind of the lack of their own imaginations. But I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little too heady, but that's what I think of when I think of land back, and it's like its potential as a movement it is about Indigenous people, but it's not only about Indigenous people, and I think that's made clear, especially in I think it's the final piece in the issue that's talking about specifically Black trans lives and the role that specifically Black movements have played in elevating Indigenous land struggles themselves. And maybe y'all can like reflect on that, and like how I would say in this moment, more so than any other moment, I believe, the Black liberation movement, or the movement for Black lives, or the Black freedom struggle, has really elevated the consciousness of everybody, including Indigenous people, around anti-Blackness, around questions of state violence, but also solutions such as abolition and decolonization, and now land back. And those aren't just kind of separate threads. They're actually part of the same movement. And you've seen a lot more kind of like crossover and elevation of voices in particular areas. But I was wondering if y'all could like reflect on that, especially that piece, because it's a really good piece.
Yeah, Jay's piece, land back means protecting Black and Indigenous trans women, is very beautiful, and I think part of their larger work that they've written about before. I think like the quote, to protect, prioritize, and platform Black and Indigenous trans women in social movements, especially ones fighting for land back and environmental justice, we must undo our own abhorrent trans misogyny without placing this labor on Black and Indigenous trans women. Like they just draw out a really good way of analyzing how like Black and Indigenous trans women often hold all of us up, and we don't protect them or prioritize their safety in our communities. So this is a really beautiful reflection of Jay's like own frontline line protection work in Vancouver too. So yeah, it's very appreciative of this piece. It's beautiful.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think it's so interesting, Nick, that you brought up Mike Myers, because this thing that you're talking about is actually also correlated to. I was watching all these YouTube videos about queer horror and the figure of Mike Myers and how he represents this fear of like gender variance and like non-normative sexuality. So I'm just like, I'm getting very cerebral now too, but I'm thinking about how these things are correlated, like
I'm going there with you.
The terror of the settler state, but then also Jay's piece about how this is predicated on damaging the bodies and souls of trans women, and trans misogyny is an inherent part of the settler colonial project and settler terror.
I was just going to add too that Emily, the piece that you just read out of Jay's piece is something that I also have highlighted in my copy of Land Back. Jay's piece is incredible for many reasons. They take on this sort of onerous labor of both sort of denouncing the trans misogyny and the anti-Blackness that we all carry within ourselves. And if there's any sort of call to action in this whole issue, it's Jay Simpson's piece. So if you pick up this magazine and you just have time to flip through one piece, I would recommend that you do this one for sure.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful piece, and I'm actually glad that we're ending the conversation on that kind of reflection, because I think it really ties together a lot of the kind of threads that we've been kind of pulling at in this conversation. But I, as kind of a call to action, I guess, for our listeners is, where can they find this work? Where can they follow you all? I know I follow a lot of you on Twitter and social media, but you all, Nikita's also works for Briarpatch magazine as well, but you all are amazing writers. I've engaged your work in certain areas, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to just talk about where people can follow your work and how best they can support what you're doing right now. So let's start with Emily first.
Yeah, I tweet too much, and my Twitter username is Emily Jane Riddle. And you can find the Land Back issue. Like Briarpatch doesn't believe in paywall, so actually all the articles are online, and you can find it, or you can order the specific issue or subscribe on Briarpatch's website, which is www.briarpatchmagazine.com.
And Nikita?
Sure, yeah. Just to follow up on what Emily said too, I think I said previously that Briarpatch does not take any government funding whatsoever, which means that all of their funding comes from sustainers or subscribers. So one of the best ways to help this independent journal is to sustain it. I don't make a ton of money, but I give Briarpatch $25 a month. It comes right out of my PayPal account. It's super easy to do, and that helps them pay BIPOC writers, trans, queer, two-spirit writers well and better, the more the sustainers they have. And Emily was right. You can find that at www.briarpatchmagazine.com. They also are offering discounts on classroom sets. So the more copies you buy of the Land Back issue, the cheaper it gets. So buy some for your classroom, buy some for your organization. And if you want, you can follow me on Twitter at Antikita, which is Aunty Kita. Thank you.
And Lindsay?
I am going to point you to the work that I'll be doing with Ryerson over the next decade of my life. Wow, that's crazy. And you can check us out at indigenousdigitalhumanities.com. We'll be undertaking several initiatives over the next decade, to bolster two-spirit, Indigenous queer, and Indigenous trans representation at the level of imagery.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining me today. And I also just want to say that I hope that this project doesn't just end with the issue. And I would like to encourage you all to think about possibly making this into a book.
Wow. Well, should we go for brunch and talk about it?
Yeah, I'm on my way. I'm only 12 hours away.
Perfect.
Okay, Doksha.